Hello, I'm Kaya. I'm going to be telling you how to take care of your good knife. So the advantage of having a good knife is that you have more control over your cuts. Say you're cutting a bell pepper, you need to cut it in slices, like long, thin slices. If you have a sharp knife, you can pretty much make these cuts as thin or as thick as you want them. If you need to cube it, same thing, as thin or as thick as you want them. The advantage of this is that if your cuts are more uniform, when you're cooking, everything's going to cook more evenly. So say you're using a bad knife and you're cutting something and you have these pieces that are huge and you have pieces that are tiny. Well, when you're cooking them, the tiny pieces are going to be burnt while the big pieces are not going to be cooked all the way through. So having control of your cuts is important. Another important aspect is, say you're cutting herbs. If you have a dull knife, you're basically just going to pulverize the herb. You're not actually going to cut through it. A lot of the flavor compounds are going to be lost, and it might affect the way that the herb tastes when you're cooking. I worked in a pizza place, and the owner wouldn't let us cut our herbs because all they had was bad knives, and it would make the basil taste bad. Drove me crazy because mine would just cut right through it if she let me. So I have mostly Japanese knives. Something about Japanese knives is that the steel is really brittle. So what this means is that it holds an edge a lot longer. It could get a lot sharper than Western knives. But if you don't use them a certain way, the blade can chip, and this will decrease how long your blade stays sharp because there'll be all these chips in it. So you want to slice, don't chop. You want to cut in a locomotive motion. So what this means is that if you have your knife, you want to move forward and down, then back, up, forward, and down, kind of like the wheels of a train. So a train would go like this, you know. And this keeps the blade from chipping, helps it stay sharper longer. When you're cutting, you want to hold the thing that you're cutting in a claw grip. So you could see in the picture, this is a demonstration of a claw grip. You could see that the tips of his fingers are angled away from his knife while his knuckles are making contact with his knife. So this just keeps your fingers out of the way. They get in the way, obviously, you're going to chop them off. You can cut your knuckles. I've cut my knuckles a lot, but that's not a huge deal, and I don't do it very often. You want to use a pincher grip on your knife. So you want to grab it at the front of the hilt, like right around here, with these two fingers. Close the rest of your fingers around, and this just gives you a little bit more mobility. You can move it however you want. It's basically just an extension of your arm. Gives you a lot more control. So if you have this great sharp knife, obviously you're going to want to keep it great and sharp. So you should sharpen it whenever it's necessary, and that's kind of up to you to determine. Since I use my knife so much and I like having it very sharp, I sharpen it once a week with a fairly high grit stone. So there's differences in grit, kind of like sandpaper. Lower grits take more off while higher grits take less off. I always use a very high grit because if you use a low grit, you're going to just be taking a bunch of metal off your knife, and it's going to decrease your knife's life expectancy. So anything above 3000 grit is good for just refining your edge instead of taking a bunch of metal off. How to sharpen it? I use a sharpening stone, a whetstone. You need to find the bevel that your blade is at. Put it on the stone. You can figure out if your knife's on the stone at the correct bevel by putting your fingers where the blade meets the stone and seeing if there's a gap there. Be careful. Obviously, it's still sharp. If there's no gap, then you just start moving your knife back and forth across the stone, and you move it this way. So each part of the blade is getting sharpened by the stone. Then you flip it over and do the same amount of repetitions on each side. If your knife is really dull, then you need to give it a new edge, so you're going to have a bunch of different stones, and you're going to move from a low grit to high grit. Obviously, you want to use protection. If you spent all this money on a really great knife, you're not just going to want to throw it in the drawer with the rest of your cutlery or spoons or something. Like I said, Japanese knives are brittle, so if they're hitting a bunch of other metal, they're going to chip really easily. Rule number 1, don't keep knives in a drawer without a blade cover. Like I said, they're going to be running into a bunch of stuff, so if you don't have any other way of storing your knives and you do need to throw it in a drawer, make sure that you use something like this. So it protects the blade. You put your knife in there. There we go. And close it up. Ideally, if you have the space, you want to use like a magnetic strip. You could see in the picture here, that's what the far left knife is being held on by. Or you want to use something like a knife block, which is just a block of wood with cuts in it where you can put your knives. So a good kitchen knife really can be your best friend. Since I've been using good knives for a really long time, as soon as I go to a regular knife or just a dull knife, it drives me absolutely crazy. I could barely cook with it. Proper care is required if you want to keep your good knife good. To the right is the knife that I bought 2 years ago, the one that I have in this video. It's a worthwhile purchase, and I've loved it ever since I bought it.